example. I take it Fukuyama is Japanese, but from
Yes,
that name.
Japanese
And,
American.
but of course the Japanese are related to the Chinese. They just became separated
Yes.
in distant and have had one of their but you know, we're talking about China in particular. That is fascinating. And I've written down here, China became inward looking, and the Middle Kingdom, that was China, foolishly decided to do without the rest of the world. And in major European countries, which you know who were highly competitive, became very adept at improving on Chinese inventions. You know the Chinese inventions such as gunpowder, the compass, paper, printing, and particularly the kite, which is what all the early aircrafts were. You've got a kite big enough and a powered engine small enough and powerful enough to get into what was in fact they used to call them kites very early on, and of course we had that. I think the Chinese became too inward looking and too conservative and decided it, because of its power structure, decided we could do without the rest of the world. So that must suggest to me that from an evolutionary point of view, it doesn't mean to say that it's going to continue, that we are possibly doing the right thing at the present time, as long as we don't destroy ourselves in the process.
Yeah, excellent question. There's a number of elements. One element is that China, yes, were very immediate. In the 15th century, China was a big maritime power.
Yeah.
And they had huge ships which were 30 metres long, and they plied the ocean way. And they went basically around the Indian Ocean, all around the Indian Ocean, and I think something even got further on the west coast of Africa. So this was terrific. But around that time, it all of a sudden stopped. And that was because so certainly at that time, China wasn't inward looking, but that was only because the emperor at that time was not inward looking. The society as a whole were much at the discretion of the emperor of the day. So if the emperor of the day was outward looking, the whole country was outward looking. But when he died and the next emperor came in, the next emperor thought, this is ridiculous. Why are we doing this? And turned inwards. Yeah. And it was from that time that China became the inward-looking country that we know up to the colonial times. Yeah. Yes.
The Europeans were going out to the Americas and the rest. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. Now also China, when it was a maritime power, was never violent. They never used their ships and vessels and so on when they went to places to do what Genghis Khan did. They went around to trade, and it was basically.
But the Mongols took control of China for a time, didn't they?
Oh yes. There is a lot of things. The Manchurians.
Four great Khans.
But what happened was that the power structure in China didn't have corrective forces that the West, and the Middle East, and I think it would be quite correct to say the Russian, that there were other operating factors. And one of those, not surprisingly, is religion. China has never had an Abrahamic religion. China's religion, as I said, was very minimalist. It didn't have a concept of a god which was supervenient. The Indian had a sort of some sort of supervenient authority, but it wasn't very strong. It's when you have Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, as we know, this notion of a supervening being, and that notion had tremendous impact on how rulers behave in the Leviathans. And
Leviathan being an extremely large thing.
No, the Leviathan means a big state.
Yeah, exactly. Extremely large thing. Yeah.
I mean, when you say large state, I mean it's large scale, but still, China had large area, but not all the time. There were periods where the Mongols and the Manchurians came in and divided up. But it's the next step down is the tribal level of society. And so if you look at today in Iraq, you know, you've got basically two tribes. I mean, there's a religious overlay, but there's two tribes, right? and they slaughter each other. Right? Those sort of things happen in China as well, and in fact, all settlements of people have had those, let's say, disasters. You know, from time to time, bodies of people. You know, it's sort of like if you look at over a century, like this, sooner or later, something like that happens.
Okay, Scott, were you interested in bringing up?
Paul.
Bill? Did you want to speak?
Well, early on you said that humans evolved from chimpanzees. But not, well, I mean, humans evolved from common ancestors, great apes, as if chimpanzees were the earliest
Yeah, I take your point. Yeah, but that's why I thought that there was a gap in Fukuyama's account, because he concentrated on chimpanzees. But I have noticed that others also relate the human origins closer to the chimps than bonobo. Bonobos are hardly ever mentioned. It's true that if you wanted the very precise about the origin, yes, the branching off started further back, and so you had some sort of common ancestor that produced the human line and the chimpanzee line and the bonobo line. But when you sort of look at it from a more what's the word, at face value, and the fact that these things exist, and the very original ancestral being that existed is not very clear. It's sort of like way back in archaeological history. It's not sort of front and centre, but I mean chimpanzees. So, you know, I mean, there's a limit to how...
Christians and others who mock you and say, oh look, they say we evolved from chimpanzees or monkeys or something like that, and they would keep on and on with that, even though they were trying to tell them, no, it's a common ancestor. And it's only recently the Church of England has apologised to the head of the Darwin band, and he said, oh, it's irrelevant. So we don't know what he meant really by that, but maybe he's saying the Church of England's irrelevant.
This is where it's tiring to keep talking to the creationists, because they are on a particular point of view, and it doesn't matter what you say, it always comes back to that. And as I say, we basically just sit and we don't particularly want to engage with them, because if you start engaging with them, it means that we have the problem that we implicitly say that the matter is debatable, because I'm sorry, as far as I'm concerned, the matter is closed. The evolution's account is the only satisfactory account for any sort of origin. And also I might say that evolution has introduced the time element into science. And this is an argument I have with some of the Queensland humanists that say, oh, you know, you shouldn't be getting so much interest in history and so forth. Well, I think that's evolution. I didn't have the presence of mind when that came up to say that evolution is the part of science that introduces the time element in science. Because if you think about physics, chemistry, biology, geology, well, not geology, right? But geology has got a time element, obvious time element. But biology, before evolution came along, is like chemistry, physics, and chemistry, physics. Right? They're time independent. In a broad sense, chemistry and physics are time independent. I mean, you have the famous gravitational equation, or the basic equations of mechanics, or the basic equations of electricity and magnetism. Whether it's 1896 or 1996 or 2096, those equations can be true. There's no evolutionary variation in those. So,
cosmology, I guess, is physics and time.
yes, and cosmology has a big dose of evolution in it. So you talk about evolution of the cosmos, evolution of the stars. So the word evolution comes out quite naturally when you talk about the time element of science. And we now, it's talked about so much, it's just like second nature to just think about certain areas of science as having the time element. And in other words, there's a history. So history, so you know, so you've got biological history and then it merges into cultural history. And so the science itself is giving a sort of moral imperative that we should be looking at our society as everything from a historical point of view, because history is sort of like part of evolution, you see?
And also let's talk about cultural evolution.
So you're in there? Sorry.
Cultural evolution. I mean, I couldn't see. I was thinking, oh, you know, maybe I'll be able to really understand cultural evolution by looking at this, but I was.
Yes. I think there's still scope for questions there. I will just get to the people who. Have you finished, Bill?
Well, I just wondered if.
Well, to give you a case of cultural evolution, I mean, just in the area of our human sexual reality. I mean, you had back in the 50s, the female eunuch, what's her name?
Germaine Greer.
Germaine Greer, right? Now, since that time, the set of ideas in that book and many others is now sort of become second nature. That's cultural. That's what I would term cultural evolution. I don't.
Well, you're not talking about it during this, were you?
Yeah, but you can't be too pedantic about the use of terms, because if you drill down to that, you can make it unreasonable in any way you like. I mean, Mao Zedong, right, said we've got to have the cultural revolution or evolution, right? Cultural revolution. But his meaning when he conveys that, I don't accept that. So, I mean, is that what you're thinking of? That's what I mean.
Oh, I think your cultural evolution as well, society, laws of society and social laws, whereby we only produce 2 children or so. You know, we're the most successful in the biosphere, the most successful organism is that produces most of the viable, fertile offspring.
Yeah, but
well, that's not the case here. That's not the case with us.
You're getting into a range of
right?
associations of different aspects of the meaning, in an eclectic way, which.
Well, I mean, I thought that was more of cultural evolution, was where our society, because we're not necessarily less fit because we only have 1 or 2 children when someone else has 10. Whereas in the biological state, yes, the one that has 10 is more successful and has a higher Darwinian fitness than the one that only has 1 or 2 children.
But what are you trying to say there, you see? That's, you see,
Because
I don't know what you, I mean, I can interpret a range of intents.
I take Bill's point that we have, there's more that we could say about evolution, but I think your turn's finished, Bill. I'm going to move on. Okay, Paul.
But Mike, still on cultural evolution, you mentioned democracy, and talking about almost almost in a Marxian sense, the development of history, the development of democracy coming out of the Western Enlightenment, and being part of sort of the natural advantage of the Western world by the West took over the world. Now, conscious of what Churchill said about democracy, as we all know, he said it's a terrible system of government. except when you consider all the other systems. And indeed, like at the moment with what's happening with the Liberal Party, what was happening with the Labour Party a few years back, we can all